Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to all of you who have dialed in to see us today. It's a little strange not to be able to see you, but you can see the slides. And today I'm really excited to give you an overview of some of the neat new things that are happening in wine and also in beer and spirits in New York. I guess you all are getting ready to come back in a few weeks for a reunion, and so while you're here, there's some interesting new things that you can visit. So we're going to talk about Cornell terroir, liquid expressions of New York landscapes. So if you have spent any time in New York, and I think most of you have, you may know a little bit about the history. We certainly, at least from a wine point of view, have had a pretty healthy industry from more than 100 years at least. The first winery was started in 1839. We saw a lot of growth, or at least moderate growth, through the beginning of the 1900s, and then of course Prohibition put a little kink in the works, as it did in most of the country. But we saw steady growth after that, and then in 1976 had a very forward-thinking governor who decided, well, you know what? Wine is a great reflection of the agriculture of our state. We've got some interesting things going on here. We should support this. And so they passed the Farm Winery Act, which made it significantly easier for small farmers, and most of the wineries in the state at that time and today were small farmers, to sign on and start producing alcohol, which was a little touchy at the time still, so that they produce this value-added agricultural product. So between 76 and today, you can see we had rapid growth, so that now in 2013 we've got more than 320 wineries. And I started here at Cornell about 5 years ago. I believe at that time we were looking at more like 260. So this has really been a lot of growth even in the last 5 years. You see here a map of the current regions of wine in New York. And of course the Finger Lakes, which you all know and love, is one of the largest. It also has the largest number of wineries. Second is Long Island out there towards the North and South Fork. And then the Buffalo area, Lake Erie, and the Niagara Escarpment are areas where we traditionally saw quite a bit of juice grape growth that is now converting at greater or lesser rates of speed into wine growth. So we're seeing lots of wineries popping up, which is really fascinating. But I'd like to ignore some of those more established regions for a moment and ask you to focus up in the northern part of the state, around Lake Placid, Alexandria Bay area, and the Lake Champlain area. And you know, the Adirondacks, beautiful part, a great state resource. We tend to think of lots of snowmobiling, skiing, beautiful mountain landscapes. We don't tend to think that this is an area where we're going to see rows and rows of beautifully manicured grapevines. But in the last few years, we've had some exciting developments from some of our colleagues further west that has changed that. Two regions up in this area specifically, the Thousand Islands region around Lake Placid, and actually three, and then also along Lake Champlain, have started growing the new super cold hardy wine grape cultivars that are from the University of Minnesota. And before you think I've gone off and I'm talking about another university too much, the grape breeder who developed these cultivars is an alum of Cornell. He got his master's here, so I guess that makes him a big red golden gopher, I'm not sure. But he's done some fabulous work in creating grapes that are cold hardy, at least to -30, which of course wipes out any grapes that would normally grow. Riesling dies at about -2. So we've got to get a lot cold hardier than that if we're going to grow things in the frigid torture chamber that can be at the Adirondacks area. So he released a series of grapes. The first was Frontenac that you see here on the right. It was released in 1996. And then, interestingly enough, in the vineyard they had a mutation, which sounds a little scary, but actually happens quite a bit in France, in grapes, and probably happens in France as well. Came up or developed a new cultivar from Frontenac called Frontenac Gris, where we had just a single little mutation in the DNA that gave us different color and also different aroma and flavor. So instead of being nice and dark red with lovely cherry aromas in the palate, we had a grape that was bronze color, as you can see, produces a beautiful golden wine, and has flavors that are more tropical fruit, more Germanic in style, so similar to Rieslings and Gewürztraminer, if you're familiar with those. And because any grape that has this sort of a mutation tends to be sort of genetically unstable. Pinot Noir is another example of this. Just recently, we have also found that there is a Frontenac Blanc. I don't have a picture of that because it's relatively new, but this is especially exciting for those of us in New York because the first commercial Frontenac Blanc was actually released at Coyote Moon up in the Thousand Islands regions this year. So the grape's been around a little bit, but just now in enough quantities for commercial production. So we've sort of scooped Minnesota on that, but that's what they get for beating us in women's hockey from time to time. So two other cultivars that you might see if you are up in the Adirondacks and interested in visiting some tasting rooms while you're doing your other vacation events are Marquette, which produces a medium-bodied red wine, and La Crescent, which, like Frontenac, gives an aromatic, Germanic style, often finished slightly sweet. So those are the 5 cultivars you may see. We're especially excited about this, for one thing, because it's opened up a brand new region in New York that previously just really couldn't grow grapes at all. But also, here at Cornell, several researchers in viticulture and enology have teamed up with our colleagues at the University of Minnesota and 11 other states across the northern tier of the U.S. to improve on ways to make better wines, optimize our wine production from these grapes. We've had them now since since 96 instead of for hundreds of years, as we have with more familiar cultivars. So we're working on optimizing growing and winemaking, and also on marketing, because it's sort of hard sometimes for a consumer to get used to a new wine grape name. So La Crescent is something they've never heard before. It doesn't sound like Chardonnay. We have to do some marketing work to figure out how to best convey the interesting and unusual aromas and flavors in these wines. So that's what's happening up north. If we move our attention back down to an area that's more familiar, the Finger Lakes, closer to the sky blue waters. You can see there's been quite a bit of growth. There are over 150 wineries in this region now. If you haven't been back for a while, this is a whole lot more than what we had along the lakes not very long ago. And of course, when we're talking about terroir and we're talking about the expression of place that we get in wines especially, it'd be hard to argue that any grape other than Riesling, nice lovely shot of our region, any grape other than Riesling is best at expressing the terroir that we see in the Finger Lakes and in our region. Because it's a grape that doesn't get a lot of processing, we tend to not oak age Riesling, for instance, it really shows all of the influence of the microclimate and the vineyard, and what processing choices we do make when we make the wine. So Riesling is starting to gain an international reputation. It's not distributed widely yet, but certainly wine writers and collectors of wine know that Finger Lakes makes some lovely Rieslings, but it's kind of led to something of an identity crisis, because when we talk about famous wine regions like Bordeaux or Burgundy or even California, wine consumers and wine experts, wine writers, have an idea what the typicity of those wines are. They know what a Chardonnay from Burgundy should taste like. We don't have that yet really nailed down in the Finger Lakes. We know that our Rieslings are quite good, that they tend to be more Germanic in style, more like Germany, say, than Australia, but we haven't defined that very well. So some of the fun research that we're doing right now at Cornell is working with the industry, with wine consumers, and also with experts like sommeliers and wine writers to try to define the typicity of Riesling in the Finger Lakes. What makes a Finger Lakes Riesling taste like a Finger Lakes Riesling? So this is just an example of some of the work that we've done. What we've done is brought these groups in, done some blind tastings where we asked them to taste Finger Lakes Riesling, as well as Rieslings from other famous world wine Riesling regions. And we develop a list of sensory descriptors, which we back up with actual food items and other things. We ask them to decide which of these aromas and flavors are most prevalent in the wine. We devise a standard. You see we've got some grapefruit zest here and some brown sugar and some mushrooms. All those are things that people smell and compare to what they smell in the wine. And then on the chart that you see, all of our lexicon of descriptors are listed around the outside of our spiderweb plot there, and the intensity of each aroma for the different wines is then shown by the peaks that you see of the different colors. So each of those different colors is a different group of wines, and for instance, I can tell you that we did find that some of the other world wines consumers found had a lot of pine needle notes, and they didn't find that, for instance, in Finger Lakes wines. Finger Lakes wines tended to be more aromatic, more floral. They tended to have more peach and more lime zest. So we're starting there. That's kind of our point of reference, and we're continuing to work on how we better describe these fascinating terroir effects and market them to consumers. So we have a better way to talk about the wines. But it's not just about Riesling anymore. That's what's really fun. Certainly Riesling is an important part of the economy at Finger Lakes, but we have all kinds of other fun things going on. One thing that you know, if you're familiar with Finger Lakes wines, is that if Riesling is our sort of our archetypical white variety, what's our archetypical red variety? And that's a question that remains unanswered. We certainly have some strong factions going on among the industry. There are the folks, a rather large group that supports Cabernet Franc. A smaller but very strident group feels that Pinot Noir is the way we should go. But other people are thinking a little more independently, and we've got all kinds of interesting new grapes that are coming online. The one you see in the picture here is Limburger, which is a cool climate grape originally from Austria that's grown in cooler regions of Europe. And we are seeing in the Finger Lakes that folks are now starting to do Limburgers both as varietals, so that means the majority of the wine is made from the Limburger grape, or as blends, as in the Cabernet Franc Limburger that you can see on the label here. And cooler climate grape, it's more comfortable with the sort of climatic issues or climatic conditions that we have in the Finger Lakes. So it grows pretty happily, and we're just trying to figure out the best way to make it so that we get the aroma and flavor that we want to sort of fill that niche. There's some other interesting things going on as well. We're looking at other cool climate varieties from Austria and Germany, like Dornfelder and Zweigelt, but also some folks are exploring some of the cool climate varieties from the northern part of Italy, like Terroir-based, which makes an interesting medium-bodied red wine, and also has been used for sparkling wines. Another one that's warranting some investigation is Separavi, which is an ancient grape originally from Georgia. That's the one in the Caucasus, not the one down south. And you'll find that individual wineries are playing with one or two or a mixture of these, either, again, as varietals or blending them in with Cabernet Franc and Pinot Noir and some of the other things that we grow more traditionally in the region. So when you're out tasting wines, certainly taste Riesling. We're known for Riesling in the Finger Lakes, but make sure to ask for that wine that may be a little hard to pronounce. That's okay. Nobody will fault you. Just ask, what's this? This looks interesting. You might find a new favorite and, a new bit of knowledge to take home for your next cocktail party. Also, very exciting to us, in addition to these more traditional cultivars that we're borrowing from other regions to see how well they work in our local terroir, the Cornell grape breeding program has recently released 2 brand new grape hybrids that were bred here. Arundel on your right is the red variety, and Aramella on the left is the white. They are both developed at the Geneva Research Station and are really suited for growers who are in sort of more challenging conditions. Aramella has lots of cold hardiness, so it's something we can grow further up north. And Arundel is really exciting because it's going to be great for folks who want to do sustainable or maybe organic, probably just sustainable, low input viticulture. It is very disease resistant, and so it grows really well on areas where we've got like high fungal pressure and don't want to do lots of sprays. So both of these were released in February, and we have got some exciting wines coming online from those. Right now, we are in the process of, they're being sold from nurseries to growers, so you won't see wines for another 4 or 5 years, but those are 2 names to look for when you come back for reunion next time around. So it's not just about Riesling, of course, but one of the really exciting things that we're finding is that the international media finally has discovered our best kept secret, and that is that we have really great Riesling and other really great wines in the region. For years, those of us who have worked in wine industries outside of California in the U.S. have always sort of had a chip on our shoulder, because you get a lot of consumers who don't understand that, yes, you can grow grapes outside of California. And indeed you can. There are wineries in all 50 states at this point. But, and those of us from New York certainly know that some of the best are a secret that we keep here. But the rest of the world has finally twigged on, and we're seeing things like this. You see one of the hot brands of 2008 was a Finger Lakes Riesling, and we're starting to find all kinds of other write-ups that are exceptional. The New York Times is paying attention, Wine and Spirits, and even Wine Spectator. And for years we talked about sort of the glass ceiling of Wine Spectator, where we could not get any wine that had New York on the label to go above an 89. That's sort of the cap for anything that didn't come out of a recognized, I say in quotes, wine region. But we've totally broken that. We've broken the 90 ceiling now, and you see we've got a nice range. This is just a sampling of some of the, I think about 120 wines that have been reviewed recently in Wine Spectator. So the world is taking notice, and that is really exciting. We're making really great stuff, and they know it. So get in before the rush happens. We sort of put the cherry on top of that ice cream sundae this year, in fact, or excuse me, a couple years ago, at the presidential inauguration in 2013. We actually had 2 New York wines that were served at the luncheon. One was this Tierce, which is a dry Riesling that's a really interesting collaboration between 3 of our our leading Riesling producers. You can see them pictured here. Dave Whiting, Peter Bell, and Johannes Reinhardt worked together to make a cohesive and interesting Riesling from 3 vineyards, and a red from Taste, which is a blend that has quite a bit of Merlot in it, from our Merlot region in New York, which is Long Island. And this is from Bedell Cellars, which is really driven by 2 Cornellians, Trent Presler and Rich Olsen-Harbich, who are the COO and winemaker respectively. So we've got a nice big red there at the at the inaugural luncheon, which we were very proud of. We were excited that both of those things came about. All right, so it's not just about wine, of course, and I am an enologist, so my heart is with wine, but we've had some fascinating things happen just recently, actually in just a couple of years, that has made it easier for folks to make beer and spirits in our state as well. All of the sort of difficulties that we have trying to get make it legal and safe for people to produce wine are about quintupled or multiplied arithmetically. When it comes to trying to get a distillery law passed. There's actually no way to practice making spirits at home like there is wine. There's no Home Distillery Act. It's really, really hard to get into this industry, and the taxation can be quite bad. But our governor just recently has decided that, like wine, breweries and distilleries really are a way that we can showcase the agricultural products of the state. And of course, we are an agricultural state. So the state of New York has made it quite a lot easier for breweries and distilleries to make small scale, to artisan production that they would sell as part of agritourism. There are some limitations on that. Unlike farm wineries, they can only produce and sell in one location, although that has opened up a little bit for wineries. But they can sell directly to customers. Prior to this, you could not go into a distillery and buy a spirit. That would just be dangerous. You had to buy it in a liquor store. But now you can actually go into a tasting room, taste a limited amount of spirits, and buy it right there. One thing that's really nice is that in order to benefit from these new laws, breweries and distilleries that call themselves farm have to use New York grown materials. So that means that we're seeing a lot more grains that are being grown for these particular things instead of importing it from other states. Really exciting. We're seeing a boom in hops growth in New York for breweries. We actually have now an extension person in hops, which is a fairly new development in Cows. So that's exciting. So in addition to wine trails, you now are going to see beer trails and eventually spirit trails. We don't have that many yet, but we are getting there. So you can see here, this is one of the variations of Finger Lakes beer trails. Not quite as many wineries there. It looks like there are about 24 on that map. But if you are more into the grains than the grapes, this would be a great way to get out and taste some of the wonderful things that New York has to offer. In the spirits world, there's quite an interesting range. You can see a couple different types of stills here, all from New York. And the one on the far right, and then in the smaller picture that's inset on it, has a really super tall stack. That's the distillation stack. And those really tall ones are used for making vodka. And interestingly enough, vodka is the spirit of choice these days. It's been on the rise across the nation for years and in New York as well. So one of the really neat products that New York is making that reflects both that marketing or that consumer interest and also the agricultural richness of the state is apple vodka. You'll find quite a few of these available. They're quite different than other things that you find. You can see one down there in the bottom, the core vodka. Beacon Skiff also makes an apple vodka. So it's a very uniquely New York product, a great way for us to use up dessert apples that are sort of at the end of their storage life. So it's very sustainable and quite interesting. I'm hoping that we get to the point where we're making some nice Calvados style apple brandy, but it's just not a big marketing boom right now, so we're working on it. But as you can see here, just a sampling of some of the distilleries that you can visit around New York. The bee vodka is actually made from honey as well, so another interesting product, and a lot of grain producing grains, vodkas, and gin too. So fun new stuff. Some of it's along wine trails and some of it's out on its own. So if you're interested in learning more about any of this, we do have extension folks in both enology and viticulture, so winemaking and grape growing. We also have got, again, I mentioned the hops extension person. We have a brewer person as well. We have a variety of workshops and courses you can take advantage of if you are close to Geneva and or Ithaca. Cuvée is coming up this summer. It's a week-long course taught by some of my colleagues in the food science department and horticulture department, where You get a nice overview of all the steps it takes to make wine, including lots of sensory analysis, which is quite important to practice. My colleague Chris Gerling and I do artisan distilling courses about twice a year. You can see there on the right, that's our little test still that we have in our vinification and brewing lab. So you get a hands-on course where you actually get to make some brandy. We have cider courses because in addition to brewing and distilling, cider, of course, hard cider is back in vogue, and we've seen a lot of interest in small cider production facilities, to the extent that some of the old heirloom apples that have been long forgotten are now being rediscovered and grown again in the state, which is great. And later this summer, we're going to have a 2-day course that's an introduction to viticulture and enology in Geneva. So if you want just a little quick overview, think you might be interested in starting a winery or a vineyard, we can help you with that as well. Also online, there are a variety of newsletters. The one I'd most like to point out is the Appalachian Cornell newsletter, which comes out quarterly and gives you an overview of what kind of research we're doing in viticulture and enology, as well as links to other Cornellians in the industry who are doing interesting things. So I've listed our webpage here on the slide, and I believe that they will post that for you as well. And I think at this point I'm ready to take any questions if I can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have an active chat box. This is very fun. Yes. So Don Kassler says that Eric Asimov, who I think is from the New York Times,
he is indeed,
has described the Ravines Winery Riesling as the best in the country. So I put a link to the ravineswine.com.
Wonderful.
It's in Hammondsport, which is about 30 minutes from here.
Mm-hmm. They have a tasting room outside of Geneva now, too.
Nice,
Mm-hmm.
nice. So then Warren Brown asks, what is linalool? And I had a similar question about Petrol, as we saw on your web chart there, that linalool was one of the flavors.
One of the descriptors, yes.
And then Petrol seems a little odd, but a couple people on here were describing that it tends to be the oily, gassy scent that comes from growing in shale.
Yeah, absolutely. These are questions near and dear to my heart because part of my research interest is sensory and wine flavor chemistry. So first I'll start with linalool. Linalool is a compound that you find in many flowers, so it often, when it's smelled on its own, has a floral, going towards rose. It's kind of a generic floral aroma, and we often will use this when we're training sensory panelists when they say, well, it's kind of floral, but they can't find a flower to nail it to. They can't say, well, it smells like rose or it smells like lilac, because lots of wines, lots of grapes produce linalool, so they are in sort of that fermentation bouquet, but they're often background. So yeah, it's a pure, we just name it by the pure compound because we often will take it to the panelists and say, here, smell this, and they're like, yep, that's it. So we'd rather use things like lemon or orange, or because they're easier for people to grasp. But linalool is one we often just resort to. Now the petrol is quite interesting. Petrol, and we like to say petrol because gasoline just sounds a little crass, right? I mean, petrol sounds much nicer. Petrol is an aroma that evolves in Rieslings, especially as they age, and is considered an appropriate and desirable characteristic, especially in German Rieslings or in cool climate Rieslings. I think the shale question, shale may be one of the, we haven't sort of figured out exactly what causes that or what would increase or decrease that aroma. We think actually that the climate itself has a lot to do with it more than the soil. And so in years where you have more or less sunlight, you'll have more or less of the compound that gives you the petrol note. And that actually is some research that my colleague Gavin Sachs, who's the wine chemist at the Food Science Department, is working on now. He's doing some great shading studies with some of our viticulture colleagues. So we're gonna get to the answer. We'll find you the answer on that one.
Maybe somehow you can work in fracking research.
Oh, geez.
Does the taste of petrol increase?
There you go. Sounds politically charged.
Yes, it does. Let's stay away. So Lynn Svanos was asking, she says, it sounded as though wines created from the two new grapes, Arundel and Aroma, will not be available for tasting at Reunion because they're too new. Which makes me wonder, so when you work on a new grape, how long do you have to wait to figure out if it's actually going to be viable to put in a wine?
Oh, it takes about 20 years.
20 years?
Yes, because it takes many, a grapevine doesn't actually produce grapes until third, fourth year of its life. So we have to first, we'll get in with one grapevine, basically. We'll test the grapes. We'll figure out if they're chemically okay, if the sugar's what we want, if the acid's what we want, if the flavor, if we taste it and taste horrible, that's it, it's gone. Some of these sort of chemical parameters we can measure. But then we have to, if we decide we want to go forward and look at this individual vine some more, we've got to plant out enough that we have enough grapes to make a small batch of wine. And then if we do some screening, we can't do big panels, then we'll have like 3 gallons of wine. We'll have some experts come in, taste them, do some basic sensory evaluation, and then we've got to grow them out. So we have enough to make big lots of wine. We also send them to collaborators. For instance, I mentioned University of Minnesota earlier. Minnesota and Cornell often send each other grapes to test. Purdue grows grapes for us, Vermont, Connecticut. We send places all over the country. All the grape breeders get together and send each other's grapes, so that we know that it grows well in Illinois as well as Cornell, and in Ohio as well as Cornell, or New York. So it takes quite a while. It's a slow process, and that's always kind of a challenge because it's long-term funding then. So that's
Right.
so. But I think actually, and I might get in trouble for this, but I think we some of these trial wines that we made, so they're research level wines, which means we don't polish them up and make them absolutely perfect, but make them quite potable. I believe CTEC is actually going to pour at Reunion, I don't know where, but I know I'm sending them some cases of wine, so it'll be around somewhere.
Maybe that's a benefit to being on this webinar.
Yes,
We'll send them out the
treasure hunt.
Okay, so we have some other questions coming in on the chat. From Mary Damask, she says, you mentioned the possibility of apple brandies, but that isn't commercially there yet. Is that due to lack of production interest, or are there any legal production or market demand problems? It's
not a legal issue. I think it's really a market demand. I mean, what we have seen for the past 8 to 10 years is that vodka across the world, actually, but in nationally as well, demand for vodka is going up and up. Vodka is just the hip thing now. I personally don't understand it, as somebody who works with grapes and works with fruit, because the legal definition of vodka, if you go look at the Fed's definition, is a colorless, odorless, neutral spirit with no distinctive aromas or flavors. Well, you can make that out of anything, right? You may have some textural differences, like potato vodka is more oily, but so it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that we're turning apples into vodka. What we find, though, is that the way that you do that distillation, you can manipulate so that some of the apple flavor stays. So we sort of ignore that theoretical legal definition of colorless, odorless, and you will taste just a hint of the apple flavor, which often is just almost floral. It's quite aromatic. So that's kind of my chip on my shoulder about vodka. But I think that these trends go up and down. Right now, whiskey and rum and other colored spirits are just sort of losing ground. When that starts to go back up, I think you'll see that we can produce some apple brandy. It's just a marketing issue at this point. It's a long answer to a short question.
And as a follow-up to that, how long do you think it'll be, if ever, before there are apple cider tours, independent of beer tours and wine tours?
Just when you get enough independent cider producers that it makes sense for people to drive from one to the other. And I think it's all agrotourism, and the wineries and the breweries and the distilleries and the cideries are sort of all mixed up together. So I think you'll probably see sort of multi-pronged approaches. You can get the map that just has the cideries on it, or you can get the here's everything that's fermented in the state, and you happen to be in this region, so you're going to go visit a little bit of each. And cheese producers as well. We've got cheese tours now in the Finger Lakes. So
yeah, there's a cidery right on 89 as you come out of Taganek.
Yeah, Bellwether.
Just a couple miles up the road there.
Got there quite a few.
Yeah.
And it's going to be really interesting when these heirloom apples. We don't have large production of mini heirloom apples yet. Only dessert apples have been available, so that's what people have been using. As we get more and more of these heirloom apples, you're going to see as much variety in the different types of ciders almost as you see in wines. We're not going to have like red and white, obviously, but there's going to be a lot of interesting, more European style, more British style ciders coming online.
Good. A few people have asked if the slides will be available after the webinar. Can we send out the PowerPoint as well?
Yes, that would be fine.
Okay. And we'll also send out a recording so you can watch this again, or if you have to leave early, you can check it out later.
I'd like to mention, too, when we're thinking about those slides, that the New York Wine and Grape Foundation has produced a lot of these maps. They do some great jobs with wine promotion in the state. They've got a great webpage, which I think we can link to, and also a lot more information about the individual regions.
Okay, good. Lauren French asks, I teach neuroscience at Allegheny College. Could I get in touch with Professor Mansfield to talk about sensory side of your research? She'd love to discuss some of these things for the smelling, tasting part of her courses.
Absolutely. I think my email will be available. So
Yes, we will.
it's the best way to reach me.
Right, interesting. Lynn has another question about grapes. Is vignoles, am I saying that correctly, or vignoles?
Vignoles.
Vignoles.
Yes.
A grape that is commonly grown in New York State. In what other areas is it grown? I live in Pennsylvania and can get it here, but I don't know how widespread its availability is.
Yep, so Vignoles, even though it has sort of a quasi-French name, is actually a hybrid that was produced in the U.S., and everybody has trouble pronouncing it. Don't feel bad, Jennifer. It's one of those things like, why did you make it so hard to pronounce? It's a French-American hybrid. It's grown in much of, from here through the Midwest. It's going to be sort of varied by winery. There's quite a bit in Ohio. There's quite a bit in Illinois, Pennsylvania. Used to be some in Virginia, not quite so much. They're mostly turning to the traditional wine grapes now. But I feel like if you just did a Google search for vignoles in wine regions, you would find where it's produced. It's kind of all over the place.
Good.
So I do want to mention that that's an interesting point when we talk about how to pronounce new grape cultivars. When Aramella and Arundel were released, Bruce Reich, who's the grape breeder, and I spent a lot of time trying to find names that were easy to pronounce.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we did that. I think
Yeah.
Aramella and Arundel aren't too bad. We actually opened it up to a public contest and got more than, I think Bruce got more than 1,400 entries from around the world, which was
Wow.
exciting. And a lot of those we looked at them and we didn't know how to pronounce them, so that was sort of the end, unfortunately. But
My mind just went to maybe you could sell naming rights to grapes. You could do your fundraising.
Yeah, and some people suggested that. In fact, some people said, I will pay this much to name this grape, but that, as the grape breeder, Bruce gets to name it, and he just felt like that was not ethical. We had actually the two names that were voted the highest when we were trying to figure out, or we got the most multiple number of entries for, were actually Colbert Red and Stuart White. We thought that was going to give us some big trouble, so we did not even go there, but that was just, I don't know, sort of shows you where pop culture is right now.
Right,
It's great. Yeah.
So Lauren French asks, New York reds tend to be behind whites in quality. They can be rather sharp. What are some of your favorite New York reds?
Well, I would urge you to rethink quality. I think it's I think when we think reds, we often think big alcoholic New World red. So California, warmer climate, bigger fruit, higher alcohol. Often the alcohol is up to 15%, which makes it 30 proof. That's a cocktail, right? And that's a really big alcoholic red wine. So if we compare our reds to other regions with similar climates, like Germany, like Austria, where we have cooler climate reds, we see that we really do have world-class, in that sense, red wines, but they are cool climate reds. So you are going to have higher acid, which is going to give you that sharpness. You also are going to have more structure, though, and sort of more subtlety and delicacy of flavor. So think of Pinot Noirs from Burgundy. They are not very big, heavy red wines, but they certainly are world-class wines. It's just not what the American palate likes right now, which totally understandable, but it takes some learning and some exposure to understand the subtleties of that. So right now I really am enjoying the Limburger. I'm really excited about, because it is a little bit heavier in body. If we think about Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc as the two reds that are quite popular right now, the drawbacks are that Pinot Noir can be hard to grow because the grape itself is delicate, thin skin. So if we have lots of rain, which some years we do, that's a problem. So when it works beautifully. When it doesn't, it's not so beautiful. Cabernet Franc sometimes can be a little green. You get those green pepper flavors, which some people really don't like. Some people love it, but some people don't like it, so it's not sort of a universal appeal. So the Limburger is kind of the best in between those. It's heartier than the Pinot Noir, but not so green as the Cabernet Franc. So you get a lighter fruit, medium body. So it's still going to be, it's not going to be a Zinfandel. We're not going to have the high alcohol, the big chewy tannins. We always are going to be lighter than that until climate change hits us, and then we'll be fine. But for now, we're dealing with cool climate varieties. I'm also excited. You won't see as many online yet, but Zweigelt and Dornfelder are two other cool climate reds. And when I've had iterations of these from Austria, which has climate just like ours, some of them are just huge. They aren't, again, as big as a Zinfandel, but they're nice big red wines. And so we've got some trial plots of those at Cornell, and some other wineries are starting to look at them. So we may see things moving that way towards sort of the red grapes that are more suited to our climate, or we know are suited to our climate. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and then we have, it's interesting that you said climate change. We've got a couple questions about climate change.
Uh-oh.
Um,
I'm not a viticulturist.
wondering about the effects of that, and if you're experimenting with warmer weather grapes in the near future, or is that not considered because of harsh winters, and also the difference between like how you sort of equal out climate change versus the technology, and what's the balance there?
Fair enough. Yeah, and it's hard. I don't know. I mean, I hope I'm not wading into the morass, but I don't know any grape growers around the world that I have talked to who think that climate change isn't happening. I mean, from the grape grower's point of view, it's just a fact. What you want to do with that is another issue, how that affects you politically. But the best defense that we have against that kind of issue is one that actually we've been developing in the Finger Lakes and in pretty much the east coast of the U.S. for a long time. And that is that we're really flexible with both our ways to grow grapes and our ways to make wine. Because we talk about, especially in the Finger Lakes, my colleagues and I talk about the myth of the average year in the Finger Lakes. Because when we take all our climatological data over the last, however many years we've been growing grapes, more than 50, an average amount, we get this beautiful, this many number of days where we have sunlight and this much rain, and it all looks great, except that doesn't reflect any actual year that we ever see. Like, unlike the central coast of California, every year is a completely different beast. So this year we had a pretty normal winter, right? Things are just now starting to, get bloom and get warm. But last year, I think we hit 80 in March, and then had a series of freezes sort of late spring, but just like one night, one-offs where it dropped below freezing, and we lost all, like apples and plums and such we lost, and some grapes as well. So what we have to do in the Finger Lakes especially is have a huge toolbox for the things that we can do to manipulate our grapes in the vineyard, as far as, different ways to grow them and different treatments that we can give them, and especially in the winery, because one year we may have reds that are very high in acid, another year they may be very ripe, so high sugar, low acid. So having a good toolbox is about the best thing that we can do right now. You're right, it's hard for us to test, warmer climate grapes at this point. Folks certainly are. I know people growing Syrah, especially in what they call the banana belt down near the southern part of Seneca Lake. But it's hard to do sort of, in the ground standardized testing for that because the years are so variable. So I think it's on the radar, but we're mostly addressing it as far as wine style, and the toolkit that we have in order to roll with the punches and make different style wines. Because of this, however, I would also urge you to recognize that our wines then are very vintage driven. So each year is going to taste a little different, because it really does. We're not trying to standardize what that Riesling tastes like from year to year. We're trying to reflect the actual climactic conditions. That's part of this whole terroir concept. Like, what have we got? So it becomes a little time capsule of what the year was like. So reds from 2010, which was warmer, they're going to be much bigger and fruitier, so less sharp, as our questioner mentioned. But the whites are going to be slightly less interesting because their acid was lower too, so we don't have that bracing acidity we want in a Riesling. Probably shouldn't say that, but they're different. And then in cooler years, the whites are going to be much more characteristic, and the reds are going to be a little sharper, a little more acidic, and a little thinner. So it pays to visit every year, learn your vintages, and just appreciate that difference instead of finding a product that has been standardized beyond all belief that tastes the same every single year.
Well, and we do have a continuous reunion club, so you can
Awesome.
come back every year during reunion, take a wine tour.
Great.
So we have a question on the phone. Michael Nolan, we will unmute you and you can ask your question.
Thank you. Does this work?
It does.
Okay, great. I'm trying to find out where we can get more statistics in terms of, just going back to the beginning of the webinar when you were talking about the various grapes, and learn more about how many acres of each of the grapes are existent now in the Finger Lakes region over the past several years, where the growth has been, etc.
Sure. I'm an enologist, so they keep me locked in the cellar. I never get a tan. The viticulturist is the one who keeps that kind of data. Seriously, the viticulturists all look great by the end of the summer, and I'm still pale and pasty. But anyway, so Hans Walter Peterson is currently our CCE viticulture specialist for the Finger Lakes. He has got all of this data and more, and I believe they can get that link online so that you can chat with him, and he can get you the stats.
Terrific. Thank you.
Sure. I can tell you that in the Finger Lakes, surprisingly enough, the top 3 cultivars are still not vinifera. Riesling is number 4. Number 1, I believe, is still Concord, which is a juice grape, and I think it's 20% of the production still in the Finger Lakes. I just saw these numbers a couple days ago, but it's not my area of expertise, so I don't remember exactly. But yeah, we still grow a lot of things that aren't wine grapes in the Finger Lakes.
Okay. Steve Gargano says wine from Charles Dyson's vineyard, Millbrook, in the Hudson Valley will be available for tasting on Friday afternoon at the Dyson School Open House.
Great.
And that's a good opportunity to make sure you all know if you are going to be here for reunion Saturday from 1:30 to 3:30 in Trillium, right here on the Ag Quad. Will be wine tasting.
And I apologize, I did kind of gloss over the Hudson Valley when I was showing you the big map, but that's another area of lots of interesting growth because there's a lot of fruit there already. So in addition to interesting grape wines, there are a lot of fruit wines and lots of fun distilleries and breweries popping up as well. Tuttletown is a lovely distillery in that region that's doing craft whiskeys especially that are great. So beautiful region to visit.
Great. And Michael is correcting me, it's actually John Dyson's vineyard. Is that the John Dyson of the Dyson School?
Sure is.
Excellent. Okay, so Jade Winfrey had a question. He says, I live here in Virginia, and you had mentioned Virginia wines, and he says, I don't think it's nearly as good as New York wine, where he's originally from. Can you talk a little bit about other wine regions in terms of your opinion?
Yes. Well, I got my master's in Virginia, and I'm from North Carolina, and there's some really good Virginia wines, let me say. However, no, academically it's a small world, and so we have gentle ribbing with all of the other schools that do some enology, including Virginia Tech. I think you're going to see different regions showcasing from different varietals, and Virginia Viognier is really great. We don't really grow Viognier up here. Riesling, not so happy in Virginia, lovely here. Other regions that are worth interesting, Pennsylvania is just booming right now, and there's sort of the Erie region in the west, and then more of a like central and eastern region that they're doing a variety of things from fruit wines to interesting grape wines. Gosh, like I said, every state in the union has got wineries, and some of them have industries far enough evolved that they're starting to see what their specialties are. So Ohio is becoming known for Pinot Gris and for Traminette, which initially is an older Cornell release. Michigan, especially up near Traverse City, so the two peninsulas that go up, Old Mission and Leelanau, also is a fabulous Riesling region, and so right now sort of Finger Lakes in Michigan. We've got some general rivalry as well for who makes the best Riesling. And they actually are both comparable and quite different, so it's really fun to taste those side by side. It's a very similar region to what we see around here. Beyond that, going a little further afield, Texas and the hill country, because it is quite warm. Fabulous Sangioveses coming out of that area. Just a lot of fun stuff going on there. And then the states that previously weren't doing a lot of grape growing, or at least were having to do crazy things like take their vines off the trellis and bury them every winter and then dig them up in the spring, like Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas, are now growing these new cold hardy cultivars, the Frontenac and the Crescent and so on. And so you're seeing booming industry in those areas, which is a lot of fun. So any place you go, if you're going to travel to a state you're unfamiliar with, check online, and most will have some sort of statewide growers association, winemakers association that'll have wine trails. And you read enough and you can probably figure out what their specialties are and what you should look for.
So Hangzone is asking about what percentage of the wineries in the Finger Lakes are certified organic and biodynamic, and what are the challenges for organic grape growing?
Well, the answer is, I actually don't know the number we may have none that are officially certified because the challenges are huge, and it mostly is this issue with variable rainfall. Right now, and again, I'm the winemaker, I'm the enologist, not a viticulturist, but my understanding is that right now, because of the way the organic laws are set up in the United States, we do not have a really great way to deal with fungal issues other than using things that contain copper. And copper, of course, is not sustainable. It's certified organic right now, but it's not sustainable. Eventually this will have a detrimental effect on your farm. And so we really, at Cornell, in extension, we push sustainable farming because we feel like, really, yes, you want low input, as much low input as you can get, but you also, if you've got to do something, you want to save your crop and or, you want to not poison your land. So we see a lot more sustainable, like near organic than actual certified organic. As far as I know, I may be wrong, but that is my understanding. Biodynamic, again, is I know people who are working towards biodynamic or who utilize lots of biodynamic principles. The ones that I know are biodynamic are largely, I know Shen Vineyards in Long Island. If they are not certified biodynamic, they are quite close. That's a good one to start with. That's the first one that springs to mind because, again, we have some of the same challenges. So, but we certainly have a lot of people. I mean, these are, again, small farmers. They're family farms who often have had the same land for a long time. They respect their land. So we're not seeing a lot of sort of heavy chemical use. It's really sort of, we deal with problems when they come up, and otherwise we let things go.
Okay. Lauren French and I had the same question, is asking what exactly does biodynamic in a winery mean?
In the winery, as opposed to in the vineyard,
Maybe are they different?
they're different. Biodynamic is a fairly complex. It's going to be hard to summarize this. It's a fairly complex set of guidelines that follow sort of the cycles of the season, and then these seasonal cycles dictate, for instance, when you prune, when you plant. I mean, they talk about days that are root growth days and days that are like, leaf growth days. And again, because I'm not a viticulturist and because this is a pretty detailed set of strictures, I have not, you can go to get 2 or 3 year courses on how to run things biodynamically, and I don't have those details. There are some scientists who are somewhat skeptical and will say, well, this is a religion because you are talking about phases of the moon and things like that. I would disagree with that. I think there are lots of practices that biodynamic practitioners use that are certainly, we haven't explored scientifically, but they certainly do go for natural and sustainable. And because there are all these sort of, not manipulations, but interactions you have with your vineyard, you are paying more attention. You're definitely out there every day and you see what's going on. So it definitely gives you a better focus on your winery. I know there are biodynamic, I believe I don't remember the name, there's at least a couple of biodynamic schools in New York, but I don't know any that are specifically for vineyards. In the winery, it's a little bit, it's mostly a vineyard horticulture type focus. In the winery, it's a sort of a different question.
Hank Zona says biodynamics are sort of like feng shui for the vineyard.
That's a great way to sum it up. Thank you.
He also had a question about physiology. What are the reason that tannins exacerbate heat in food? Do they act as a coating or do they chemically boost heat?
That's a great question. I cannot give you an answer to that I have proven experimentally, but the things that tannins do, and tannins are naturally occurring plant compounds that we see in higher concentrations in reds and in whites, because reds are fermented on the skins where most of the tannins are, and they get extracted into the wine then. They dry out your palate. I mean, the reason we call them tannins is because they interact with the proteins in your saliva the same way that they used to be used to interact with proteins on hides when they tanned the hides. That's why they're called tannins. So they actually bind up all the saliva in your mouth, so you no longer have the natural lubrication that you had. So if you drink cold tea, for instance, and then rub your tongue on the roof of your mouth, it feels quite rough, and it's because all your natural lubrication has been bound up. So if tannins are binding up all that saliva, and then you are tasting something hot, you don't have, first you're getting more immediate contact of the capsaicin or whatever it is with your, mucosa, I guess, and then you also don't have the saliva production to sort of rinse that off. And for what I've been told, most things that are hot, especially capsaicin, the red pepper heat, rather than like wasabi and the horseradish heat, that capsaicin is oil-based, and so it is actually an oily coating on your palate. So beer, which has a little bit of alcohol, enough alcohol to sort of dissolve that oil, and then a lot of water, enough water to wash that off, is often a better choice for like trying to rinse away some of the heat than, say, wine, which has a lot more alcohol and also these tannins. The alcohol to the extent that it can kind of exacerbate the burn. So
interesting. So Terry Horner is asking where can they find more information on the distilling workshops that you mentioned earlier?
All right, so our webpage that I listed on the very last slide, which I think Jennifer can get linked up for you. I don't think we have one planned until December. We usually do like a December and a spring, and this year we didn't do the spring. But there will be a list of workshops from the Enology and Viticulture program, and if you just watch that page, it will come up. Also, if you send me, there's the webpage right there. From that webpage, you will find the email address for Chris Gerling, And if you send him an email and ask him to be put on the list, he'll put you on the list so that when we know a class is coming up, we'll give you a call and let you know so that you don't have to check the webpage every other day or every other month. They fill up pretty fast. And we get people from all over the world. I mean, there are always at least 2 or 3 international folks. Chile, London, I mean, it's really fun. So.
So before the webinar started, you were mentioning the wines class here, and I bet a lot of people on the webinar took that wines class as seniors. Can you just repeat how you're talking to that professor? Are you working with? Are you going to be a part of that class at all?
Well, there's several
in the hotel school.
In the hotel school, that's actually a different professor. So I was mentioning, there is, of course, a huge and very well respected wine appreciation class in the hotel school, which is very comprehensive, very nice class. There is a similar class, slightly smaller but still quite large, offered in food science that has, it actually is mostly wine, more beer, and a little bit of spirits. So that the slant's a little bit different because we're looking at it from a food science perspective rather than from, a sommelier perspective. I was mentioning that we have a new researcher now in the hotel school who isn't teaching that class, but is teaching wine marketing classes, which I think is fairly new, and is doing consumer psychology research. And we're talking about some collaborative work we can do, talking about, well, if we want to define typicity of Riesling in the Finger Lakes, how do consumers approach that versus how scientists like, sensory scientists like I approach that. So we're looking at some ways to join forces, which will be really fun.
Right, interesting. So in your, while we're waiting for more questions here, and we've got about 8 minutes left, so if you have any last burning questions, put them in the chat box. And while we wait for those, in your biography that I was reading before the webinar, it said that you that you do some research on fermentation nutrition. Is that like nutrition like what Brian Wansink does, or is that nutrition in a different scientific sense? Because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's different from what Brian does. He has some really fun studies. It's actually the yeast nutrition. So when we think about making wine, the thing that most winemakers measure and that we're most concerned about is the amount of sugar in the grape, right? Because the yeast takes the sugar and turns that into alcohol. So the yeast is using the sugars that are naturally in the grape or in any other fruit as a carbon source, just like we would. We all use glucose. It's just how we work as cells. But the other thing that yeast need is nitrogen. And it's really hard to measure nitrogen in grapes. With sugar, even if you have no way to measure it, you can at least kind of taste it and get an idea. There's no way to just empirically guess how much nitrogen you have in your grape. And without nitrogen, the yeast can't use the sugar very efficiently. The fermentations become stuck, which means they're kind of slowing down or sluggish. Or they just stop. And when that happens, that's when the yeast start to stress out. They start to throw out lots of really stinky compounds instead of the lovely fruits and flavors and linalool, petrol, the things that we want to happen in the wine. So we have to make sure they have enough nitrogen. So we're looking at, there's quite a bit of variability from site to site, from cultivar to cultivar. We have yet no good metrics or no modeling system to try to figure out how much, a given grape cultivar has. So at least for Riesling in the Finger Lakes, where we were able to do quite a bit of sampling, we've now devised basically a predictive model, so we can figure out, all right, if you're in this vineyard in this year, what do you think your yeast or your nitrogen content will be? So
I read that thinking maybe you were going to fortify wine with vitamin D or calcium or pulp or something.
Yeah, nope.
They do to orange juice.
No.
Okay, we have a question on the phone from John Clement. John, if you would like to ask your question.
Am I on your line?
You
Yes,
are.
you are.
Oh, good. I'm going back for my 75th reunion,
Wow.
Wonderful.
and I wonder if you could give me some ideas or suggestions on what I could ask for Merlot.
Merlot. Sure. So the biggest Merlot production region in New York is Long Island, and so anything from Long Island, it's maritime climate. It's a little warmer than we get in the Finger Lakes, so they tend to ripen Merlot a bit
Yeah, but
more.
I'd probably want something from around Ithaca, wouldn't I?
Well, you want to go visit local wineries then?
Sure.
Okay. Gosh, off the top of my head, You stumped me off the top of my head. I can't think, because we see a lot more Cabernet Franc than Merlot. But you know what? If you get in touch with us, I can look that up for you, and we can find some places that produce Merlot. Another choice is if you go to Northside Wine near 13 in Ithaca, they have got a great selection of local wines, and they probably could point you towards several Merlots if you don't want to go too far outside of town.
Good.
North side, is that what you said?
Yes, Northside Liquors.
Yep.
Ask for Dave Pohl. He's the regional expert.
Okay, great. And I wanted to ask if, Michael Nolan, you still have your hand up? I was wondering if you had another question on the phone, or if that was left over from the first question. Okay, Mike.
All set. I sent it in via the email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Good. All right. Well, we've only got 3 minutes left. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think people should know about New York wine?
Gosh. Sure. I'll tell you one of our challenges right now, because some of you might be able to help with this. As New York wine producers, we are sitting right next to, we're the same state as the city that drinks the most wine in the United States. I mean, New York City has got the most variety of wines available and drinks more wine than any place else in the country. But they still look a little askance at our New York wines. They're starting to warm up to Long Island, and they're starting to warm up to Riesling. But if you live in the cities or you're visiting the cities, ask for the regional wines, because we really, that's a great place for us to get agrotourists. It's a great place for us to interact with, and we aren't seeing a lot of action down there. So it's just a plea for help.
Great. Well, I think our Cornell Club serves New York wines.
They do, yes.
They
The
do.
Cornell Club is great about that, and we've gone down and done some tastings there as well, which is wonderful. So.
Very nice. Okay, well, thank you all for participating, and when you close this webinar out, you'll see a survey. Please give us your feedback or ask any additional questions, and we will be sending out again the slides and the recording of this, as well as some links to various websites. And John, we will get you the name of a Merlot in the Finger Lakes. That
Absolutely.
would
Or
be
several.
tasty. Or several. All right, thank you all. And don't forget, again, if you're coming to Reunion, the Saturday afternoon wine tasting in Trillium is from 1:30 to 3:30. And I would suggest you get there early, because it gets quite busy for the whole 2 hours. So get there early. All right, have a great weekend.
Thank you.